Foundation.com. Hope you'll tell your friends about our website, worldviewradio.com, worldviewradio.com. Thanks for listening. Take care.
You are watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon House. You are watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon House.
Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the National Security Team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan, and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
Funding for tax cuts that the American people badly want. Now, China's responding with retaliatory 34% tariffs on the United States. Those are set to begin on April 10th. Meanwhile, House Democrats, this is interesting, are trying to stand in the president's way with a vote to undo his national emergency declaration, that order that will give him tariff authority. But this newfound hatred of tariffs from the left stands in stark opposition to what Democrats were saying in the past. Roll the tape.
In terms of tariffs, I think it's interesting to note that the average U.S. MFN tariff on Chinese goods coming into the United States is 2%, whereas the average Chinese MFN tariff on U.S. goods going into China is 35%. Is that reciprocal?
What they have said is that we need to not worry about manufacturing in America, because what we should establish is a policy of unfettered free trade. We don't need tariffs. What we need is to allow corporate America the freedom to throw American workers out on the street.
We had a tire case in which they were flooding us with cheap domestic tires or cheap Chinese tires. And we put a stop to it. And as a consequence, saved jobs throughout America.
Emily, the context to that Obama soundbite is that he implemented, oh, wait for it, tariffs on China. I believe they were to the tune of 35%. So, oh, how interesting how you just have this.
Tariffs and trade barriers, Trump's strategy to rebuild American strength. That's the subject of our Training Tuesday this week. And the Rob Maness Show is live on World YouTube, our X Spaces simulcast, Rumble, YouTube, Truth Social Plus, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and Roku. Well, fear, intentionally overblown fear in order to induce instability in the American economy is what legacy media reporting and the so-called experts are attempting to do in order to derail President Trump's Liberation Day tariff and trade barrier removal program. That's what I call it, the removal program. I know what you're thinking. We, the people, are a lot smarter now and much more informed about the realities of today's false narratives than to fall for that, right? Well, unfortunately, I don't think that's really the case. And when combined with monetary and economic policies that have been put in place by prior administrations, things like the stock market volatility we saw right after the tariffs were announced can and do happen. Does that mean we're going to see another Great Depression? Will jobs evaporate, leaving families destitute again? I don't think so, but as the president has been very clear about, there's going to be some bumps in the road in the short term at a minimum. What are the steps the Trump team can take to ensure our success with the strategy? Well, Todd Sheets is my guest today, and he wrote a great two-part article laying out the facts and realities of the policy and those that have come before it. After leading the Raymond James real estate investment banking practice, he retired to focus on investing, economic history, psychology, and writing, and I think a little bit of music in there. Todd's the author of the newsletter On Wealth and Progress that's currently available for free of charge on Substack, and of the book 2008, What Really Happened. Todd, welcome to the Rob Maness Show.
Delighted to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on. I really liked your article because, for those that don't follow this kind of stuff, you went into a little bit of historical context. And I guess my first question is, are we really in danger of falling into another Great Depression or even a depression at all because of the Trump trade policies?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a scare tactic that has been used, interestingly, in this case, from both the left and parts of the right to kind of drum up things like the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the early 1930s that many of us were taught back in the day were a key part of putting us into the Depression. But the fact of the matter is, we now know that those tariffs were more a symptom of the problems that were happening at that point in time. And they have, if any impact, it was very, very small and minimal, and that there were other factors that actually caused and led us into the Depression, caused it to last for as long as it did. And none of those factors, that were real driving forces at that point in time, are issues that are being resurfaced with the policies today. So I think those are misguided fear tactics. Could we have a recession? That's definitely possible. I think a good analogy is the kind of uncertainty that occurred when COVID first hit, and it wasn't clear how much disruption it could cause and how long it might last. As it turned out, it wasn't that long, and it was severe for a while, but we worked our way out of it. The markets recovered, the job markets have recovered. We're back to very low levels of unemployment. So to me, it seems like that's the most likely worst case scenario that we're dealing with here.
Yeah. A lot of that was structural, the way things had been structured. And after the Depression, weren't some laws and policies put in place to provide guardrails and safeguards against that?
Yeah, they were. And the fact of the matter is, there was two aspects to the Depression. Most of us have learned about the domestic depression and have learned to think about it as a U.S.-based domestic issue. The fact of the matter is, it was an international phenomenon. And so if you look at the international side of the equation, the real cause of the Depression are the things that we're now trying to finally address here, which is for different reasons, but in back going into World War I in the early 1910s and continuing through the 1910s, when Europe became engaged in that, they became involved in massive deficit spending. That deficit spending on the war led to significant inflations of their currencies, which moved their currencies out of whack in terms of international trading, and significant debts that they incurred, mostly to us, that they weren't able to repay. And they spent the next 10 years in a series of failed and misguided policy initiatives to try and resolve those problems, none of which worked. And as a result of that, those problems finally caused the collapse of the international monetary and financial systems in the early 1930s, beginning around 1930, as a matter of fact. And so, that's really where the international problems came from, was these massive deficit spending on the part of primarily Germany, France, and Great Britain. It led to massive inflations, which distorted their currencies. And then it led to massive borrowing that they couldn't afford to repay. And those kinds of problems, for different reasons, are ones that we're trying to address and resolve right now. The second part of it was on the second domestic cause really came down to the failure of the Federal Reserve, which had just been created in 1913 to provide the liquidity to the system in a time of bank panic that it had been created to provide. And because it didn't do that, the bank panic spread and went on for 3 years, by the end of which roughly 40% of the banks in the country had failed. And that was really the primary driver of what happened domestically. And those issues have been addressed with things like deposit insurance. And even the Fed has learned the lesson of their mistakes at that point in time and have shown that they're ready to step up and provide liquidity when needed in times of crisis now.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about when the president announced the tariffs and the day they went into effect is that he ran on this. He got elected on this. This was a big part of his campaign. So when I voted for him, I was thinking about it. I want to get things set right on the trade issue, but especially on the manufacturing issue. But the stock market acted like it was out of the blue. Is there something about the stock market today that that enables that to happen? Because I wasn't surprised that it went down. I was just surprised that it created that cliff that happened the first day or so, and then it started coming back up and everything. Well, what's going on with that?
Yeah, I think there's two factors there. One is stocks are very highly priced relative to historical standards of value. And that is a function directly of the easy money policies that the Federal Reserve has employed for the past 20 plus years. As I pointed out in the book that you mentioned, 2008, What Really Happened, that was a key factor in driving the housing bubble that collapsed and led us into the financial panic and then what some people have called the Great Recession. Unfortunately, they didn't learn their lesson. They came out of the Great Recession and basically doubled down on those easy money policies. They lowered short-term interest rates to historic lows throughout the 2010s again, and then also engaged in buying long-term bonds to try and push down long-term interest rates. That was the first time in history that they had done that, and their balance sheet shot up from somewhere around $600-700 billion to over $7 trillion at its peak. And so those easy money policies, for a variety of reasons, didn't show up in consumer inflation, which is normally what would have forced them to pull back on them. But they did show up somewhere, and the places they showed up were in bond prices, stock prices, and housing prices. And so one result of all of that is we have, stock markets that are valued depending on exactly how you measure it or adjust the measurement for some changes that have occurred in the composition of the indexes like the S&P 500, as much as 2 times the normal valuation. And that makes them susceptible to disruption and uncertainty. If they're more reasonably valued according to traditional norms, they're less susceptible. The higher they get, the more likely they are to be affected by something that throws them out of whack. So that was one big factor. The second big factor is, I think the tariffs as they were proposed by Trump, which I think is primarily for negotiating purposes, were much higher than I think people anticipated were going to be proposed. Now, everybody's jumped to the conclusion that that's going to be the end result of all the negotiations that are just getting started right now, which I think is a mistake. But, if you conclude that those tariffs originally proposed on Liberation Day are going to be the ones actually enacted and that we're going to live with going forward, then I think people concluded, well, this could be much more severe, could lead to a quicker and deeper recession than we were anticipating.
Wow. I was just surprised that, the big guys, when I think about the big guys, I've only done, playing around in stock market and trading and that kind of stuff. But the big guys usually, they project out to the future based on what they're hearing and seeing in the data, but hearing about future policy, and they usually prepare for that. Do you think it's just because the tariffs were higher than they thought they were going to be that they weren't ready? It seems like they didn't do anything to prepare for this.
Yeah, I do think they were caught off guard by the magnitude of what was proposed initially. And there's even some supporters on the right that reacted. There's a hedge fund manager named Bill Ackman who came out, I think, had some conversations with Scott Bessent that were relayed to Trump. And I think they were somewhat surprised. You are exactly right. The job of Wall Street, when it's acting rationally, which is not always the case, But yeah, exactly. When it's acting rationally, their job is to estimate the earnings that companies are going to generate, over the next couple years and then extend it out into the future. And if something happens that throws those earnings expectations out of whack or out of what, they had predicated valuations on, then that can cause disruptions. And again, that kind of goes back to like what happened with COVID when things started shutting down. People didn't know how long it was going to be shut down for. Companies that were expected to generate healthy earnings for a period of time, then we thought, well, geez, they could actually lose money for a period of time. How long will that go on? How deep will those losses be? That can throw things out of whack. And that, we got pretty significant stock market adjustments at that time as well. So I do think there's an element of that took place here.
Okay. Well, we got to take a commercial break. When we come back, though, I want to dive into what you talked about the history of how we got to the trade deficits that we're at today here in the 21st century. It's a fascinating story. I think most people don't really have a grasp of the totality of it. We'll be right back with Todd Sheets.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Is the government tracking you? Do they have access to all your data? Well, if you go to worldviewtalk.com, you'll find out about a cell phone company that, does not store your data. They don't do that. This is what they're known for. They don't store your data. You have privacy. You're not being tracked. That's why a lot of folks are turning to worldviewtalk.com. You'll find their prices are very competitive. All the details are there at worldviewtalk.com. Again, worldviewtalk.com. Oh, while you're there, not only do they have cell phones that aren't tracking you, you can find out about how to get a satellite phone. Should the whole system go down and you want to communicate with a family member or a loved one, you might want to have a satellite phone. Or how about their solar generators? They have great solar generators. Check them all out right now. Worldviewtalk.com, worldviewtalk.com.
Let me ask you about the constitutionality of these tariffs. As you know, the Constitution, right there in Article 1, Section 8, makes it very clear that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Congress has the power to impose tariffs, not the president. And the president has cited this 1977 emergency law that doesn't mention tariffs. This is a law about sanctions, about seizing foreign assets. So how concerned are you, and are you prepared to defend this in court? As you know, there's already at least one court challenge to the constitutionality of these tariffs.
The president knows the law. The president's general counsels know the law. They understand this, that Congress has passed laws that gave the president the ability to protect our national security. We need to make medicine in America. If you don't think that's national security, you're not thinking it through. We need to make semiconductors in America. We need steel and aluminum in America. We need to manufacture in America. If we just run gigantic trade deficits and sell our soul to the rest of the world, eventually we are going to be the worker for the rest of the world. We're going to be the thinker for the rest of the world, but they're going to manufacture. And if someday they say, gee, we're not sending it to you, we'll be nothing. So I think the president has national security in mind, and he's here to protect America. We need to reshore these things, and we all know it. So it is vital for us to reshore it, and we know it.
Mr.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Training Tuesday, and we're talking about the tariffs and trade barriers and President Trump's plan to remove these tariff deficits and trade barriers that have caused this massive trade deficit for the United States. And my guest today is author of the newsletter On Wealth and Progress. That's available free of charge on Substack, Todd Sheets. We're talking through this. Todd, I wanted to show that little clip there just to give people an idea what the media really is stirring the pot on this plan in ways that they really should know better. You know, it's not that difficult to go do the research and look up the laws that Congress has passed at what historically presidents have been empowered to do by Congress, really, and the Constitution. But the other piece is the national security piece of it. I think it's important for everybody to understand, and this reshoring concept, which I'm sure we'll talk about several times during the rest of the show, of bringing manufacturing home. So my question has always been, as I've never really studied it as an amateur historian, but I've got snippets of it. How did we get to this point? Why did our own leadership, and how did they do that, get to the point where we can't even make antibiotics in this country, which is one of the things Howard Lutnick was alluding to?
Yeah, so as I pointed out in the second piece in the Substack series that I'm doing on these tariffs, I called it A Tale of Two Empires. And, if we were to break it down, in the simplest way, I think we could say we won the Cold War against the Soviet Union in large part because we recognized that if we isolated their dysfunctional command and control communist economy, that eventually, especially if we pushed them on it, like Reagan did in the 80s with the defense buildup and the changes that unleashed economic growth here in America, eventually they would fall on their own economic sword, or the failure of their own economic sword. And that was a critical insight that, created one of the greatest victories in history. Winning a battle the magnitude of the Cold War without, as Margaret Thatcher put it, having to fire a bullet was enormous. Yeah. Well, the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991. So we took a very different approach with China. So you might say we won the Cold War by isolating the Soviet Union with their dysfunctional economy, and we have lost the trade war because instead of isolating, we've tried to absorb China's dysfunctional, centrally planned economy into the world economy. And so the earliest seeds of this that I talk about in the newsletter go all the way back to the 1970s, with Nixon reaching out to begin to establish relationships with Chairman Mao and Communist China in the 70s, based on the idea that he wanted to try and create a counterbalance to the Soviets' power, and failing to recognize the things that Reagan saw that wasn't really necessary. And then Carter formalizing relationships with China in the late 1970s and recognizing the Communist Party as the legitimate government of the Chinese people. Now, if we fast forward to the early 90s, when the Soviet Union is collapsing, there was this enormous sense of accomplishment, this sense that free markets, democracy, free people was the future of the world overall. And this idea emerged that we could engage with China, bring them into the global marketplace, and they would be uplifted. And as their citizens were uplifted, they would become democratic, and they would trade with us on a fair and equal basis, like other Western countries more or less do, sometimes less, which is we can talk about later also. Unfortunately, what all of our leaders failed to do, as I point out in that article, was to read the bloodstains on Tiananmen Square's walls. And because of the improvements that were made during the 80s in the Chinese economy, when they started to move in a direction towards free markets, but before they had been fully brought into the Western economy, in the late 80s, there were student-led protests that took place in Tiananmen Square. Mm-hmm. And those were pro-democracy protests by people who wanted to move the country closer and closer to Western standards, very much like what was anticipated happening here in the West. But after a few weeks, the hardliners in the Communist Party decided, we can't let this go. They moved in, the tanks rolled in, the soldiers came in. The estimates are all over the map in terms of how many people were killed, but they range from the Communist Party's own estimates, which I think are in the low couple hundreds, up into the thousands by other credible parties. And they sent a very distinctive message at that time, which we failed to read and understand, which is that these pro-Western institutions would only be adopted as far and as long as they are in the best interest of the Communist Party. So we failed to recognize that was one big critical mistake that we made.
Yeah.
You want me to keep going? I don't want to, just keep running, but you want to pause for a moment, or should I keep going there?
I just wanted to ask you, it's a huge mistake. And as you were talking, I'm thinking, well, here we are today, and we have these massive companies like Apple, Tesla, that are over there. And we know that the Chinese Communist Party has people like the Uyghurs in concentration camps and other groups doing forced labor for minimal wages, sometimes even no wages at all if they're in concentration camps doing the work. But American policy continues to almost ignore that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, that's definitely accurate. I mean, we made this mistake in 1991, and that was just the first of the two big mistakes that were made at that point in time. So, but to your point, before we get on to the second one, once that process was set in motion, subsequent presidents have complained about what's occurred, but nobody's done anything about it. And it's just gone on and on and on. And even today, we're acting as if we can't possibly disrupt the global trading status quo, as though it was working just like we planned all along. And the unfortunate reality is it has turned out to be almost as far from what everybody hoped would happen at that point in time as anybody could imagine. Yeah. So let's go back to the second big mistake that was made then. In addition to failing to read the bloodstains on Tiananmen Square's walls, the second one was failing to comprehend how monumental this transition would be of trying to bring China into the world trading system as a way to help them, improve the disastrous results of what central planning had done to their economy. If we go back to 1990, so two things. If China had been a small country relative to the size of the economies and the people in those economies that was trying to absorb it, that might not have been a problem, probably would not have been a problem. If China had been a reasonably well-off country, that is unlikely that it would have been much of a problem, even though if it was large. But neither of those things were true. In 1990, if we look at the Western populations as Western Europe and the United States combined, which was the basis for the healthy Western economy that China was going to be absorbed into, the Western populations were a little over 600 million. Mm-hmm. China's population at that time was around 1.1 billion, almost 2 times the size. So we're not talking about absorbing a small dysfunctional economy into large healthy economy. We're talking about absorbing an enormous dysfunctional economy, much bigger in terms of population than the ones it's going to be absorbed into. So this is likely to have a dramatic impact, especially when you then look at the living standards and compare the living standards on the two sides. In the Western economies at that time, GDP per capita, which is gross economic production per person, in the West was over $20,000 a person. In China, it was barely over $300 a person, or 1.5% of what we were earning. So you think of the enormous difference in wage scales and wage expectations, and you step back and say, here we are trying to absorb a country with a population base almost double the size of the US and Western world combined, with income standards that are 1.5% of ours, and when you look at it in that way, you have to say, my God, if we don't manage this transition in some way, this is going to massively disrupt the living standards for many people in the Western economies that are trying to bring them into up out of the depths of this poverty and degradation that had been created by the failure of central planning in China, just like what happened in Russia. So that was really the second big mistake that then put us on this path to the $1 trillion deficits that we have today, of which for a long time China accounted for almost 50%. Today it's below that, but if you attribute some of the movement into Vietnam and Mexico that's happened from China, they still account for roughly 40% of the deficit. So that's the big problem. And it's not only an economic problem, but as you alluded to also, because the Communist Party has used the growing economy, not to engage with the West by Western standards, but basically to kind of create a new trade and even militarily aggressive posture, anti-Western posture. We have funded that. And as you said, for 30 some years now, we've watched all of that happen without doing anything about it. And we've got to do something about it, because the longer we contribute to the growth of their economy relative to the size of our own, the more we are just funding our opponent in this geopolitical economic confrontation that we're involved with right now.
That's right. We're going to take another break. When we come back, though, I want to talk more about China, Todd, and the economy, and give you a chance to describe why it's just as dysfunctional, maybe even more than the Soviet economy was, and what our opportunities are there, and how President Trump's team is taking advantage of those opportunities. We'll be right back with Todd Sheets, author of On Wealth and Progress on Substack. It's free of charge. Go subscribe to it. We'll be right back.
All right, everybody, we are
Hello, I'm
halfway
Brandon
through.
House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now. And we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
What I want to say is I think that we underestimate the difficulty, as you said, that China is in. So I'll just give you a couple stats. Together, America and China represent almost half of world GDP. But underneath the covers, what we keep forgetting time and again is America is the market that matters. China has an aging population. They have a very difficult case for foreign investment. In fact, foreign investment in China has fallen off of a cliff. They have very murky rules on IP, and they have a very difficult economic forecast if they shrink. And so when you look at the China case, they're in a worse position than we are, which is why they have to sort of come to the negotiating table now and figure out some reasonable thing. And I think this is what President Trump was alluding to when he said they want to come to the table and they don't quite know how.
Now,
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Training Tuesday, and we're talking tariffs, the trade barriers that President Trump is trying to level out and get removed so that the United States once again takes its rightful place as, if not the powerhouse, a major powerhouse on the economic system of the entire world, and our workers get the opportunity to have good, solid, long-term, good-paying jobs right here at home as part of a manufacturing base that really, quite frankly, existed pre-World War II, allowed us to win World War II, was that enabler that those manufacturers were there but don't exist now. My guest today is Todd Sheets, who has been in the investment real estate world and is an author of the newsletter on Wealth in Progress and wrote the book 2008, What Really Happened. Todd, I wanted to chat about China itself. And, you know, the average person that I talk to, if I get into a discussion about China's economy, they think that I guess they equate China's strength in the world export market as a manufacturer, which they are. You have to acknowledge that's a reality. Equate that with they have a really strong economy on the level of the United States economy, but that's just not true because they're a communist country, right?
That's absolutely true. And I think another reason for the confusion is because China's economy has grown so rapidly for a period of time, it gives this sense that many have, I think, bought into, is that they are on the in the process of an inevitable rise that will eventually lead them to have a larger and more powerful economy than ours. But the fact of the matter is very, very different. I think one thing to keep in mind is the rise of China's economy has not happened because they have figured out some way to mix intelligent central planning with market-based economies, and they've come up with a better approach than a free market-oriented system. The rise of China's economy is substantially attributable to the impoverished wage base that those centrally planned economies caused and left them with in the early 1990s. If it wasn't for the huge wage differentials between their population with a GDP per capita, as we just talked about, that was 1.5% of ours, we would not have seen the movement of manufacturing into those markets. The manufacturing went there because there was cheap labor, which they've continued to exploit through some of the kinds of policies that you just mentioned. In addition to that, these things have started to change in the last decade or so. And so, as their wage scales came up, those differentials are not as big as they used to be. Even though their economy has grown a lot, it's now still maybe 60% of what ours is. But keep in mind, like we were talking about earlier, if they have GDP of, let's say, $19 trillion and we have 30 trillion, they're trying to take care of over 1 billion people with that GDP of 19, and we're trying to take care of, 340 million with ours. So again, on a per capita basis, they're in nowhere near as strong of a position as we are. And then thirdly, they've been hurt here recently by the first round of tariffs that Trump imposed, and then by what happened with COVID. And when China shut down after COVID, a lot of manufacturers around the world and in the United States kind of, had a wake-up call for the first time that we can't be completely reliant on Chinese manufacturing for our supply systems and that type of thing. And so that did start to cause some things to shift and diversify already. And all of those things have already caused a slowdown in China. Now, they try to react to this. They've got to keep the people happy, even as they repress their freedoms and they exploit their working class. They've got to try and keep them happy and make them feel like the Communist Party is in the best interest of the average Chinese citizen. And so they responded to these things with significant centrally planned stimulus programs. And they have basically built, millions of housing units that are unoccupied, some of which were never completed. Many Chinese people lost money for having invested in homes that never got finished. They've built massive excess capacity in their manufacturing base, which now they're being forced to try and export the deflationary consequences of that to the rest of the world. So this is an economy that is far from healthy. And is teetering on the verge of or in a deep recession, even though that may not show up in the officially published statistics, and potentially a deflationary depression. So they're in a weak position right now. I guess that all begs the question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the question I had, you were probably just about to say it, was so Xi responded to this round of tariffs. Now, the first round of tariffs you were talking about was in the first Trump administration, and Biden actually kept most of those, from what I understand. But this round of tariffs, Xi's responded with this massive trade war and reciprocating in kind. But he doesn't have. It doesn't sound like, when I hear you speak about the economy, he doesn't have the structural and foundational support to be able to actually pull that off.
Yeah, I think the issue is, I think he was worried about appearing weak to his own people and to the rest of the world if he succumbed to this really significant confrontation that Trump put on the table. And I think in addition to that, he was concerned, and justifiably so, that if he caved to a strong and aggressive American response, then the same thing would also happen in Europe. And that whatever he did with America, he would end up having to do with Europe as well. And, that would cause severe problems and damage. And so he decided, instead of, picking up the phone and starting the negotiations, which I think would have been in their best interest in spite of the issues that we just talked about, he chose to escalate what was happening. And I think from a global strategic perspective, even though that may cause us a little bit more pain in the short term, I think that actually played into our best interest, because I think rather than reaching a quick deal and renormalizing things with China, I think the best thing for us is to engage in policies that help isolate that economy and force that country to deal with the dysfunctions of the model that they operate under, instead of helping them alleviate those dysfunctions by continuing to let them participate, in the free market economies of the West, which have been pulling them up for so long here.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm concerned about, and I've made the statement too, that we should be isolating the Chinese communist economy like we did the Soviet Union, to that extent, really. But we've allowed it to get so large, and for their exports to get so embedded in our consumer market. Is that still doable? Is the question I have, just because I'm fairly naive when it comes to economic policy at that level. But from a national security perspective, I'm still on the side of isolate this economy and get this ball rolling, which is why I voted for Trump and why I'm like you. I think it's in our better interest that they are responding in kind, because it gives us that opportunity to further isolate it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also agree with you that the unfortunate fact that we didn't address this earlier is going to make it more difficult and more painful to address it now. But, I ended that second Substack piece by saying, if not now, when? And if not Trump, who? And I think those are the critical issues. The longer we let it go, the worse the adjustment process is going to be. And so, there's some very, very smart people and dedicated in the Trump administration. Trump himself is no novice when it comes to economic issues and negotiations. And I think what we have to hope is that, and I think it's a reasonable hope, is that they can take a very tough stance and do it in a way that results in the least amount of disruption here domestically that we have to experience. But unfortunately, I think there's a level of pain that we're going to need to experience as we decouple with China and go through this process of, isolating them and rebuilding the supply chains and the manufacturing that we need here to make sure that our security is intact.
Yeah, we're starting to see, I'm monitoring shipping and everything, and I've learned a new term this week, blank loads. So we're monitoring that, and eventually the cargo, the cheap goods cargo coming to the United States that we're so used to being able to buy is going to dry up if this continues to go on. And I think that's where, when the president and you and I talk about the short-term pain, that's where it's going to be felt the most. Unfortunately, it's going to be felt by large portions of the population that depend on being able to buy, a cheap baby buggy or a car seat or, those kind of things that we had embedded in our markets all this time. And it even goes down to meat and those kind of things now, because China's been able to purchase a lot of the meat manufacturing in the United States. Well, when we come back, I want to get into this reshoring concept, because that's a big reason why I supported this plan under the Trump administration, is to bring manufacturing home and see if we could set the realistic expectations on that from a timing and what type of manufacturing perspective. And then I want to talk about Europe, our European allies, the countries that are either making those phone calls to the president or not making the phone calls, and what the impact that's going to be on the overall plan and vis-a-vis China. We'll be right back with Todd Sheets. We're talking tariffs and trade barriers.
I think Trump is a master negotiator. I think what has to happen next, if we recover the losses, and I've lost a lot of money over the last week or so, I don't know about you and Robert, but these foreign leaders have to give Donald Trump a phone call. Sandra, it's very simple. And they have to say, look, we're ready to sit down at the bargaining table. We're ready to bring our tariffs down. That's the right thing for them to do, Sandra. Their tariffs are 2, 3, 4 times higher than ours are. I think Trump is ready to negotiate. And at the end of the day, if he can win, and look, Robert, I understand what Robert's saying. This is a very risky strategy, but I think it'll work out. And if it does, I really believe in the end of the day, we could have freer and fairer trade that will benefit everyone. But I'm sick and tired of these foreign leaders saying, oh, how dare Donald Trump start a trade war when these countries have tariffs that are multiple times higher than ours are, Sandra.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. We're talking about exactly that: tariffs, trade barriers, and my guest today is author and former real estate investment expert, Todd Sheets. And Todd, that right there is what Steve Morton said about our other countries making the phone call. Europe is who I am concerned about. They've been intransigent on NATO. They're overly involved on the whole Ukraine-Russia war issue. They're tangled up economically over there. And quite honestly, I would never be able to buy my Ford F-250 King Ranch turbo diesel pickup truck if I was living in Germany right now at all, because they wouldn't let it happen. And that's the kind of trade barrier and tariffing that countries like our supposed friends have been doing to us for decades. It's not all just about China's big market and population and what we've allowed them to do. A lot of this has got to do with allowing our friends to take advantage of us, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think from the overall perspective, both on trade And from a strategic perspective, China is the big factor that has to be addressed and the most difficult one to address for the reasons we were just talking about. But you're exactly right. There's this whole other issue of our trade with others that was allowed to get out of balance in some cases, or most cases, probably for good reasons, post World War II, when Europe was devastated and a trade system evolved that encouraged them to rebuild and gave them the opportunity to rebuild as quickly as possible. That was very much in their favor. But then it's a little bit like what we were talking about with China. Even after the rebuilding took place, nobody ever sat down and said, okay, well, these disproportionate or unbalanced relationships that were allowed to exist for a period of time need to be rebalanced and brought into alignment. And so this is just another factor that, I think Trump has raised, justifiably so, and that we need to deal with. And as you suggested, also, you brought defense into the discussion. We have continued, and Europe has been happy for us to continue funding their defense, and they still expect us to play the lead role in even what is now, a relatively, and I don't mean to dehumanize the importance of this, but the skirmish between Russia and Ukraine is a battle between two relatively small economies over in Eastern Europe that is about as far removed from the United States as possible. And yet Europe is still waiting for and looking to us to play a lead role in resolving all of that. And so, this issue of us kind of paying the world's defense bill and continuing to trade under models that are unbalanced and disproportionate, these are other issues that are being addressed and need to be addressed right now.
Yeah, and the manufacturing, offshoring our manufacturing, those countries have played a big role in that too. I mean, a lot of it did go to China, yes, because of the cheap labor and all that. But down in Mexico and those kind of things. What should we be expecting realistically from a reshoring of our manufacturing capability perspective to happen here with this policy that the Trump administration has implemented? And I ask that question because, I, as a national security guy, would like to see our country return to the manufacturing base, not just defense, but across the board, that more what we look like pre-World War II, where we had, because it was non-defense manufacturers across a very wide spectrum of capability and in large numbers that enabled us to be able to actually have to destroy 10,000 B-17s that had never flown before because we made so many and we're turning them out so many at the end. But that manufacturing capability in the end of World War II was only enabled because we had this wide variety of manufacturers in the country before it started. I would like to see us return to the equivalent of that here, 21st century, because if we don't, God forbid, I don't want this to happen, we ever were to get into a peer war, a great power war, like with China, maybe China allied with Russia globally, we would really have a hard time being able to pull off what we pulled off with that victory in World War II because of manufacturing. What is a realistic expectation based on this policy?
Yeah, I think a couple of things in this area. I'm going to touch on these in the third piece in this series on trade that I'm writing on the Substack newsletters. There's a strategic element to what's happening, which is what you're addressing very much. Do we have the manufacturing base to produce the weapons, the ships, the drones, the technological military things that we need to be able to protect ourselves and our allies from a potential future war that involves us? That's an enormous issue. Do we have access to the mineral resources and those kinds of things? So I think that has to be a focus and one of the objectives, and everything that I hear about, the direction that they're going with all this, I think it very much will be. I think if you move beyond that, it starts to get a little bit more difficult because economies and economic models are always changing. And if we went back to the 1800s, early 1800s, 90 or 95% of the population worked on farms. Nobody knew what was going to happen. If we had said, there's going to be this massive industrial revolution, it's going to wipe out 90% of those farming jobs. And 100 years from now, only 10% of the people or something like that would be working on farms. My God, you'd think it would be a disaster. And we never could have anticipated, at that point in time, that by the early 1900s, something like the automobile, which hadn't even been invented, would be out there and creating enormous jobs for Americans. Or that, we were on the verge of creating a whole entertainment industry around things like radio and motion pictures and television. And so it's very hard to anticipate exactly where the economy will go and where the jobs will be that will provide the best opportunity to people. So my view on these issues is more along the lines of, let's look strategically at doing what we need to from a military perspective to make sure we can protect ourselves. And then let's balance out the playing field with all of our trading partners, including primarily Europe, which is where the biggest trade, and Japan, where the next largest trade deficits are after you get past China, Mexico, and now Vietnam, interestingly. Let's level out that playing field so that the jobs of the future that are created by AI, continued technological expansion and development, the growth of the entertainment industry, wherever those jobs are, our people are at least on an equal playing field with the rest of the free world that we're trading with. And we're making sure that we're not being taken advantage of by countries like you mentioned, like Germany, whose tariffs on automobiles are 4 times the level of what we charge them, or countries like Japan, who have erected other kinds of trade barriers which make it very difficult to sell our goods and services into the Japanese market. So I definitely think all of that needs to be addressed. I think it's harder to predict exactly where the good jobs are going to be, but I'm very optimistic about the fact that they will arise. And if we continue to lead the world in these areas as we always have, and as we are in a position to do, and we can get our financial house in order, that we are potentially poised on another, great half century or century of upward mobility for this country. In some ways, we're better positioned relative to the rest of the world than we have ever been if we can deal with these big and important issues.
Yeah, I think the result, we're starting to see results already from the Trump policy. NVIDIA, I think, announced today that their artificial intelligence computers that are being manufactured will be 100% manufactured inside the United States now. But I'm glad you pointed that out about the jobs piece of it, Todd, because, even if we were able to bring every piece of manufacturing back home that we've divested over the last 35, 40 years, that doesn't equate to the same number of jobs in the end as an end state because of AI, because of production automation and those kind of things. But it does have the promise of jobs that are stable, that you don't have to have a college degree to get, and that you can be in the upper middle class and and build generational wealth on, doesn't it?
No, that's true. But I do think, we've been mired in substandard growth as a result of a series of misguided policies for over 20 years now. And if we can get back to the kinds of 3 to 4% real GDP growth that we have had in the past when we've had good policies, I think the jobs will come out of the woodwork. It's hard to tell exactly where they'll come from. And we are also now back down to low levels of unemployment, below 5%. And I think there will be opportunities for all Americans in that kind of system. And wages will start coming up. And I'm very optimistic about these issues if we can deal with and solve these very, very difficult problems that the current administration is trying to address.
Yeah, as we close out here, I just wanted to touch on, get your thoughts on how this $37 trillion in debt. I get the deficit spending year to year, and I think the Trump administration will make a dent in that, if not eliminate the deficits on the budgeting and everything. But the debt is the thing that really concerns me when I think about the long-term economic prospects. Will this tariff program and trade barrier program help us eliminate that debt more rapidly than we would have otherwise?
Yeah, definitely. If it's successful, yes, because one of the big keys is eliminating the deficit. So let's just say you have debt to GDP is 100% and the deficits are 6%. If you're not funding some of that deficit with inflation, which has its own problems, then the debt relative to GDP is growing 6% a year, and that compounds very quickly. So eliminating that deficit is one big thing. And then the second key is to get economic growth going. And you can grow your way out of the problem. If the debt can just be held at a constant level in nominal terms, and it stops growing, and the economic growth ramps up, then over a 20-year period of time or so, you can bring the debts back down to a much smaller percentage of GDP, and then we're in a much healthier position.
Fantastic. Well, Todd, thank you so much for coming on the show and spending this time with us. It's been a great show, a lot of education, a lot of training on this issue. I look forward to sharing it out there. Have a great day, folks. Go to check out and sign up for his newsletter on Wealth and Progress at Substack. It's free of charge. You can't ask for more than a free education on something so important as this. I'm Rob Maness, and I'll see you tomorrow on Whistleblower Wednesday. My guest is Chad Caton of the Conservative Caucus. You know him as I'm Fired Up, our friend, and we're going to be talking about building the GOP MAGA team of the future and why it's critically important we get it done now and not wait. We'll see you then.
You're watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon House.